Section 4.4, Dividing Decimals. Dividing decimals is very similar to dividing whole numbers. The only difference is learning how to deal with a decimal point. To start, let's divide a decimal by a whole number. Here I have the division problem, 62.5 divided by 5. You can see that I'm going to do this actually on a piece of graph paper because it's very important, as always when dividing, doing any kind of division, that you make sure that you keep everything lined up. And sometimes I think it's easier to show that if I'm using graph paper. So I'm going to use graph paper to do this, and I'm going to put 62.5 on the inside is the dividend, 5 is on the outside as the divisor. If I'm going to go through and do this, all you really have to do is be careful with where the decimal point goes. So notice the decimal point is right here. I'm going to treat this just like a regular division problem, except the decimal point just has to go straight up in the answer. So I put the decimal point where it goes, and now I'm just going to ignore the decimal point in the problem, and I'm just going to go through and divide. So I'm going to ask myself, how many times is 5 going to 6? How many sets of 5 are there in 6? There's 1. 5 times 1 is 5. I subtract, I get 1. I bring down the next number, which is a 2. Same thing, how many sets of 5 are there in 12? There are 2. 5 times 2 gives me 10. I subtract, I get 2. I bring down the 5. How many sets of 5 are there in 25? There are 5. 5 times 5 is 25, and I get 0. So my answer to this is 12.5. 62.5 divided by 5 is equal to 12.5 because I just took the decimal point and I just put it straight up where it was in 62.5. Notice that I got an answer, or I got a remainder, I should say, of 0. Whenever dividing by decimals, I'm always going to have a remainder of 0. And we'll talk about that as we go. Let's do another problem similar to that. Once again, I am going to have a decimal divided by a whole number. So if I have 2.76 divided by 8, I'm going to go through and I'm going to do that problem once again on graph paper. So I have 2.76 on the inside and 8 on the outside, and my decimal point is after the 2, so in my answer the decimal point has to go straight up. Now when I go through and do this, I'm going to ignore that the decimal point is there, and I'm going to ask myself, how many sets of 8 are there in 2? Well, there aren't any, so I have to ask myself, how many sets of 8 are there in 27? There are 3. 8 times 3 gives me 24. I subtract, I get 3. I bring down the next number, which is a 6. How many sets of 8 are there in 36? Well, there's 4. 8 times 4 gives me 32. I subtract and I get 4. This is where in the past we would just give a remainder, but now that we're working with decimals, we can't give a remainder. And in order to not give a remainder, remember, you can always add a 0 to the end of the dividend if you want to. 2.76 is exactly the same amount as 2.760. So I added a 0 after the 6, and now I'm going to bring that 0 down, and now I have 40. So now I'm going to ask myself, how many sets of 8 are there in 40? Well, there are 5. 8 times 5 gives me 40, and I have a remainder of 0. So my answer to 2.76 divided by 8 is 0.345. Now, sometimes in the book they probably have 0.345. Usually we try to put a number before the decimal point just so that decimal point doesn't get lost, and we know that there is a decimal point there. So 0.345 would probably be what they would have in the answer key in the book. Let's do another one, this one with a 2-digit divisor. So I have 13.78 divided by 52. And once again, notice that 52 is just a whole number, 52. So I have my 13.78, and once again, I have my decimal point between the 3 and the 7. So I know in my answer, my decimal point has to go straight up. And now I'm going to go through and I'm going to ask myself, how many sets of 52 are there in 1? There aren't any. There aren't, and if I do 13, there aren't any. So I have to go all the way to 137. This is why I think it's important to use graph paper sometimes, because I need to make sure that I get whatever digit I'm going to have in my quotient now above the 7. Well, if I go through and do that, 52 times 2 gives me 104. That's the closest that I can get to 137. If I subtract, I get 33, and I'm going to bring down the next number, which is an 8. How many sets of 52 are there in 338? Now, rather than going through the work to get it, I'm just going to give you the answer, but you might have to come over here to the side and do a little bit of math. What's 52 times 5? What's 52 times 4? What's 52 times 6? Whatever the case may be, you might have to do a little bit of math. If you do that, 52 times 6 is going to be the closest. 2 times 6 gives me 12. Put down the 2, carry the 1. 5 times 6 is 30, plus 1 is 31. So I get 312. So 52 goes into 338 6 times, and that's equal to 312. Now I'm going to go through and subtract. I get a 6, and I get a 2, so I get 26. But once again, I cannot have a remainder because I'm dealing with decimals. So I'm going to have to put a 0 in the dividend. So now I have 13.780, which is the same as 13.78, and then I'm going to bring that 0 down. So now I'm saying, how many sets of 52 are there in 260? Well, once again, if you go through and do the math, you'll find that there are 5, and 52 times 5 is 260. So I get a remainder of 0. So the final answer to my problem is 0.265. And once again, I would probably put a 0 in front of that decimal point to get 0.265. Next, let's turn our attention to dividing a whole number by a whole number. So let's say that I have 7 divided by 2. If I want to go through and do that, once again, I'm going to have a 2 on the outside as the divisor, and I'm going to have a 7 on the inside as my dividend. Notice that there is not a decimal point in my dividend, but remember, all whole numbers have a decimal point to the right of the number. So I'm going to put a decimal point right there, and then I'm going to put that decimal point straight up in the answer in the quotient. And then I'm just going to, once again, ignore the decimal point and do the division. So how many sets of 2 are there in 7? Well, there are 3. 2 times 3 gives me 6. I subtract, I get 1. I can't have a remainder, so I am going to put down a 0 after the 7 and bring it down. And now I'm saying to myself, how many sets of 2 are there in 10? Well, there are 5, so now I'm going to multiply 2 times 5 and get 10. I have my remainder of 0. So the final answer to this is 3.5. 7 divided by 2 is equal to 3.5. Let's do another example. If you were given 15 divided by 8, 8 is going to be the divisor on the outside, 15 is going to be the dividend, and once again, I need to put a decimal point after the 5 because that's the whole number, 15, and then I'm just going to bring the decimal straight up. When I go through and do that, I'm going to say how many sets of 8 are there in 1? Well, there aren't any, so I have to go how many sets of 8 are there in 15? Well, there is 1. 8 times 1 gives me 8. I subtract, I get 7. I can't leave a remainder, so I'm going to add a 0 and bring it down. And then, how many sets of 8 are there in 70? Well, there are 8. 8 times 8 gives me 64. I'm going to subtract, I'm going to get a 6. Once again, I can't have a remainder, so now I even need to add another 0, and I need to bring it down. How many sets of 8 are there in 60? Well, there are 7. 8 times 7 gives me 56. I subtract, I get 4. I still have a remainder. I can even add another 0. I can continue to add zeros, as many zeros as I need to, so that I do not end up with a remainder. So I'm going to bring that 0 down. How many times does 8 go into 40? It goes in there 5 times. 8 times 5 gives me 40, so I have an answer of 0 for my remainder, which tells me I'm done with my division, and 15 divided by 8 is equal to 1.875. So now let's talk about dividing by a decimal. Remember, at the very beginning I had mentioned that the only difference is learning how to deal with the decimal point when you're dividing by a decimal. So we've talked so far about dividing by a whole number. Because that works so easily to divide by a whole number, what you need to do when dividing by a decimal is to change the division problem so you are dividing by a whole number. In order to do that, I'm going to change this problem slightly. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take the divisor and I'm going to make it a whole number. In order to do that, I'm going to move the decimal point 1 spot to the right. If I do that in the divisor, I have to do the same thing in the quotient. I'm going to move that decimal point 1 spot to the right. So really, what I have when I do that is I now have the problem 32.5 divided by just 5. These two division problems are really the exact same division problem, because when I went through and I moved the decimal point in this number right here 1 spot to the right, I really multiplied it by 10. When I moved this one spot to the right, I really multiplied that number by 10. So I'm going to get the same answer if I just go through and do 32.5 divided by 5. So let's go through and do that. So now I have 5 on the outside. I have 32.5 on the inside. And just like before, I'm going to take my decimal point, I'm going to move it straight up, and now I'm just going to do division. How many sets of 5 are there in 3? I can't do that. How many sets of 5 are there in 32? There's 6. 5 times 6 is 30. I'm going to subtract. I'm going to get a 2. I'm going to bring down my 5. How many sets of 5 are there in 25? Well, there are 5. 6 times 5 gives me 25. I get a remainder of 0. There's no reason to add any other zeros in my dividend, so the final answer to this problem is just 6.5. So going through and dividing by a decimal, well, we just don't do it. We change the problem so we're actually dividing again by a whole number. Let's go through and do another one. 0.658 divided by 2.8. When I go through and do this, I just go through and I first of all write the problem the way it is. 2.8 divided by 0.658. And rather than going through like I did before, you can certainly do that if you want to, I just go through and I change the decimal in the problem after I've written it. I know that I want this number to be a whole number, so I'm going to move the decimal point 1 spot to the right, which puts the decimal after the 8, so it's just 28. When I do that, this decimal point here also has to be moved 1 spot to the right. So my decimal point that I have in blue is where it needs to go, and then I'm going to put it straight up. So now I have 28. How many times does 28 go into 0? Well, it won't go into 0. How many times does 28 go into 6? Well, it won't go into 6. So now I'm going to say, how many times does 28 go into 65? Because remember, I'm ignoring that the decimal point is there. When I do that, how many times does 28 go into 65? It goes in there twice. 28 times 2 is 56. Now, it's really important, this is why I'm using graph paper, that I have things lined up. Now, I have 65 minus 56. When I go through and do the subtraction, I get 9. I bring down my next number, which is an 8. Now I'm saying, how many sets of 28 are there in 98? Well, there are 3, and once again, I kind of did the math a little bit to the side, but I'm not doing that now just to speed things up a little bit. 28 times 3 gives me 84. I'm going to subtract, and I'm going to get 14. I can't leave a remainder again, so I am going to put a 0 at the end of this because it does not change it, and bring that 0 down. How many sets of 28 are there in 140? Well, when you go through and do the math, you'll find that there are 5. 28 times 5 does give me 140. I subtract, I get 0, so I'm done. So the answer to this problem is 0.235. Let's do one more problem. This one may be a little bit more complicated. I'm dividing by a decimal. And I'm going to write this problem out the way it is, but I'm going to write it with the dividend and the quotient in this familiar algorithm mode. So I have 0.038. So when I write that 0.038, that's on the outside. And on the inside, I have 0.8132. Now, when I go through and do this, I'm going to first of all figure out the placement of the decimal point. In the divisor, the decimal point is right here, and I need to move that decimal point so it becomes a whole number. So I need to move it 1, 2, 3 places. So now, really on the outside, I just have the number 38. But since I moved the decimal point 3 places in the divisor, now I have to move the decimal point 3 places in the dividend. So it becomes between the 3 and the 2. And then before I start, I'm going to put the decimal point straight up. So now, the way that problem is written, I really have this problem. I really have the problem 38 because I changed it to a whole number, and I have 813.2. Now, I probably would not go through and rewrite it this particular way. I could if I wanted to, but once I move the decimal point, that's really what I'm doing. So now I'm saying, how many sets of 38 are there in 0? There aren't any. How many sets are there in 81 or in 8? There aren't any, so I have to go to 81. How many sets of 38 are there in 81? Well, if you go through and do that, you'll find that there are 2. 38 times 2 gives me 76. So that 76 has to go under the 81 because that's where the 2 went, is above that 1. Now I'm going to subtract. 81 minus 76 is 5. I bring down the next number, which is a 3. How many sets of 38 are there in 53? There's 1. 38 times 1 gives me 38. I subtract, and I get 15 when I go through the subtraction process. I'm going to bring down the next number, which is a 2. How many sets of 38 are there in 152? Well, once again, when you go through and do the math, you'll find that there are 4. 38 times 4 does give me 152. So now I subtract, I get 0. So my final answer to the problem is 21.4. The last idea to consider in this section is dividing by powers of 10. But before we talk about dividing, let's review multiplying by powers of 10. If you remember, earlier we had talked in an earlier section about multiplying something like 5.32 times 10. Because there is 1 0, that meant that I had to move the decimal point in 5.32 one spot to the right. So 5.32 times 10 would give me 53.2. Remember, if we had multiplied 5.32 times 100, since there's 2 zeros, I have to move the decimal point 2 spots to the right, which would then give me the whole number, 532. And finally, remember that if you were given 5.32 times 1,000, there's 3 zeros, so I would have to move the decimal point 3 spots. Now, in order to do that, I would have to add a 0, because in order to move that decimal point 3 spots, I can only move it 2, and then I have to go through and add that 0. So the final answer would be 5,320. If you're dividing by powers of 10, it works exactly the same way. Except instead of moving the decimal point to the right, you are going to be moving the decimal point to the left. So if I have 5.32 divided by 10, there's 1 0, which tells me I'm going to move the decimal point 1 spot to the left. So the answer now is 0.532. And if you want to, you could put a 0 in front of it just to make sure that that decimal point is apparent. Let's say you were given the problem 8.41 divided by 100. There's 2 zeros here, which means I need to move the decimal point 2 spots to the left. If I move it in front of the 8, I'm only moving it 1 spot. So I have to add a 0 in front of that. So I get a final answer of 0.0841. And once again, I might want to put a 0 in front of that decimal point. Remember, the decimal point in the original problem was between the 8 and the 4. I moved it 2 spots to the left to put it as 0.0841. Let's just do one more. If you were given the problem 7.2 divided by 1,000, I have to move that decimal point 3 spots to the left because there are 3 zeros here. So in order to do that, I have the decimal point right now between the 7 and the 2. I need to move it 3 spots to the left. That's 1. In order to move it another spot, I have to put a 0. In order to move it another spot, I have to put another 0. So my final answer is 0.0072 because I moved it 3 spots. 1, 2, 3. Once again, I might write it as 0.0072 just so I have that leading 0, which sometimes makes it easier to see. As you can see, dividing by decimals is not a lot different than dividing by whole numbers. You just have to learn what to do with the decimal point. Please let me know how I can help as you work through the homework in this section. Thank you.